It's with the transport professional. I'm Erin De Silva, Head of Student Outreach. So today on episode 3 of our series, we're back with Andre Frieslaar, who today is going to speak about public transport planning. So we're very privileged to have him here. And Andre, thank you very much for coming again to chat with us. Can you please just give us a bit of a background on, your public transport career?
Thanks, Erin, and thanks everyone for listening to us. I graduated in 1989 with a BSc in civil engineering from UCT. I was, hell-bent on building some very beautiful arch bridges as a young man, and after a few years working for a construction company, got fairly disillusioned with lots of dust and concrete, and decided to join a consulting engineering firm and joined HHO Consulting Engineers in 1992. And the position I was offered was in the traffic engineering and transport planning department. I had no prior interest in traffic engineering or transport planning, but got stuck into it, and I've really enjoyed various aspects of traffic engineering and transport planning, namely the problem-solving aspects thereof, the analytical side of it, and also the creative aspects of coming up with conceptual designs and dealing and solving transport problems. But it was interesting. At a particular point in my career, I started to have more of an interest in public transport planning, and that really came out of a sort of a deep desire to start to redress some of the issues that we found in our cities that really came about due to the apartheid planning. And as a result, a lot of people were living very far from work opportunities, were spending a lot of money and a lot of time getting to and from work. And I really felt that as a young engineer, I could do something about that. And so I started to get involved in public transport planning. I took a bit of a shift, and I cut my teeth on a number of interesting projects. First of all, getting involved with the taxi industry in looking at the development of taxi ranks, providing shelters there, providing loading facilities for taxis. And then that sort of moved on to a more conventional project where we looked at the N1 corridor in Cape Town. But with my public transport hat on, I brought in as much public transport into that project as I could. And then thirdly, that led me on to what was called the Cape Town Public Transport Corridor Strategy, which I'll talk a bit later on. And that was really coming up with almost like a London Underground map of public transport for Cape Town, and which then led me into one of the greatest projects I ever got involved in was the My City BRT project, which is almost a pilot BRT project in South Africa, and really got me involved and a lot of experience in public transport planning.
So Andre, you've really outlined the importance of public transport within the likes of South Africa. Can you please just provide us with some principles of public transport planning?
Okay. So, what is a public transport planner per se? Really, it's a spatial planning professional who's responsible for developing public transport systems. So, if you break it down a bit more, if you are planning public transport, you need to look at the planning and design of various public transport elements. The first sort of set of elements, I would call them, are what are the modes. So in public transport, we have the obvious modes of rail and potentially light rail. You have buses, and then you have taxis. And those are the sort of three major modes that in South Africa we deal with. The sort of next sort of element I would talk about would be the public transport networks. And here you would talk about, where do these public transport vehicles operate? How do they operate? And here we talk about right-of-way. Obviously, trains operate on rails, and they are predominantly in their own right-of-way. That means they have a separate, facilities, and we've seen that, things like the Gautrain and Metro Rail, they operate in their own reserves. But then it gets a bit more interesting when you talk about buses and busways, and buses can operate in their own right of way, or they can operate in mixed traffic. And then they can also operate in priority lanes. And so that's another sort of principle of planning, is working out where these almost road-based forms of public transport need to operate. The next thing is they can't just operate and not stop, but they need to pick up passengers. So we need to look at stations and stops and where those should be located, and how they should be sized, and you know, and should they have ticketing facilities and all that kind of stuff in them. And then thirdly, terminals and ranks. You know, at points where you might change from one mode to the other, you need to have terminals. Similarly with taxi ranks, you need to look at major terminals. And then there are the maintenance depots that we need to look at as well. So, you know, where do buses go at night to be refueled, cleaned, serviced, and ready for operation the next morning. And then once you've got the modes and the public transport networks in place, as a public transport planner, you need to look at, you know, developing the routes and the schedules that people are going to be able to use to use your public transport services. So again, in terms of public transport planning, the challenge again is to look at that at the hierarchy of transport, and here we are really looking at the walking, cycling, and public transport modes predominantly. But we need to look carefully when we design public transport, especially when we're doing it in current road reserves, at the impact on the private car and the movement of freight vehicles and high occupancy vehicles in that same right of way. It's easier when you are in a separate right of way and you've got your own reserves, like trains often have. But often with road-based public transport, we're trying to fit them into existing reserves where we really have very high you know, flows of private cars and commercial vehicles. And so it's trying to balance all of that. I think in terms of really describing the principles, Erin, I think that maybe is a good point to stop.
So you've spoken about there's various components that actually make up public transport planning. It's not just putting a bus on the road, we're going to have a stop here. You know, it's really balancing. You know, where are people coming from, where are they going to, which is the best route, and you have to obviously balance then the economics of that route and how much can you charge and whatever else. So you've outlined a few of your interesting projects like the My City Bus, BRT systems. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on those projects for us?
Yeah, sure. I'll just share this. So the first project I really want to talk to is this public transport corridor strategy I mentioned earlier. And this is essentially a map of Cape Town. I've put the rail network in here, which is the green routes, which is sort of the backbone of the system. But added to that, we've added the red routes and the yellow routes, which are really the sort of public transport, the road-based public transport routes. And you can start to see that we're starting to have what we call that London Underground network of public transport routes serving Cape Town. And really the vision as a public transport planner that we had was that we'd restructure Cape Town into an integrated and sustainable city through this provision of this, what we call a socially just integrated intermodal public transport system that provides people with a level of accessibility to economic, but not only economic, also the recreational and social opportunities that our city can offer. So I think that was a sort of fundamental step in this whole process, and then taking it a step further into another project which I spoke about in the transport planning session was this N1 port planning, where again you can see here when we do these integrated transport plans, we come up with the sort of the green managed busway lanes as part of this overall process. And I mentioned the N1 corridor process, that here we brought in public transport into this, and it was almost like the initial building block for what happened a couple of years later, which was the MyCity system, which then came into being. So as a public transport planner, this was the pilot project that I was involved in. It was what called phase 1A of the MyCity, which really involved a feeder route within the city, a terminal at the civic centre, and then a trunk route running all the way out to Tableview with some feeders in the Tableview area. So as a transport planner, we had to come up with developing that route, the schedules for that route, and sizing the type of buses that would be involved in running up and down these corridors. So and this is just an impression of what the sort of vision we have to have as public transport planners, taking a derelict railway siding and transforming it into a world-class public transport corridor with the right kind of infrastructure in it. As I said before, the different elements that we have to design as a public transport planner are the stations. This is a typical station along the route, showing where people access the public transport system, can stand safely out of the traffic and out of the elements of the weather, and can access the buses as they dock at the station. So station design is an important part of it. This is a single pod station, and when you're at sort of major terminals, you need to design more pods than this, and look at transfer of passengers from one route to another. These are typical stops that we have from the feeder buses. One of the interesting things as well, as a public transport planner, you need to understand things like universal accessibility, and how passengers with disabilities can board and alight public transport vehicles, and look at all the elements associated with that. Also involved is traffic engineering, and the whole how do you manage the conflict between public transport vehicles and other traffic at junctions, and also how do you manage the pedestrians and their access to station precincts. So a lot of that planning has to happen as part of the development of these concepts. This is a terminal station. Obviously, terminals are far more complex than a single station. They can involve up to 10 or 12 different docking platforms. There are different potential fare regimes that you have to look at. So all of that needs to be planned fairly carefully. We need to look at the spacing of these platforms along the different faces of the terminals to make sure that buses can access each of the platforms independently. So a lot of planning and design goes into these major terminals to make sure passengers can get in and out of these terminals, and that your access gates have the right capacities, etc. And then finally, at the end of the day, as I said, buses need to go somewhere. They need to enter into the facility. They need to be refueled, washed. They need to have somewhere to park. And then when they need their maintenance, they need a maintenance building to go to be serviced. They also need buildings for the operator to have offices, and also for the staff who run the buses and the refueling depots and the maintenance facilities to have facilities for them, like lockers and showers and all that kind of thing. So depots form also a very important function in the public transport system. So you can see there are a broad range of elements that go into public transport planning. You almost need to consider every aspect of the journey and of the life of the bus and your passengers when you come up with a system like that.
I think this is fantastic. You've really shown us how convoluted public transport planning can actually be, with the various moving parts that you obviously have to give a lot of consideration to, and just sort of grapple with in terms of that. What are some of the biggest challenges that you find, sort of hamper public transport planning, maybe within South Africa or just in general as a profession?
Yeah, so I think the first one I'd like to highlight is that designing for public transport in South Africa, you're often in opposition from sectors that want to promote the private car. You often have to wrestle for road space with car drivers, and until the system is up and running, you can't really get the benefit of the public transport capacity. You've got to build the first whole system before you can put the buses on it and actually start to get people to move from private cars into buses. So I think that's often a challenge in the design phase of a project, where people might be saying to you, "Well, take a lane away from the cars." It's often more difficult than that, because the construction can take 2 to 3 years, and you can imagine the kind of congestion you'd have if you took a lane away from one of your busy arterials. So I think that's often a challenge. I think also public transport is difficult in the political environment. A lot of these projects have come under a lot of flack because of they obviously cost money. You're trying to come up with a car competitive public transport system, but you're having to price it to price the tickets or the fares at a level that the users of the system can actually afford. And often the users of these systems are people who are poor, and they currently use taxis. So we're trying to come up with almost a taxi competitive system, but it's car competitive. So that's also quite a difficult thing to get right, and convincing the political masters that public transport is good for their cities, and it leads to more sustainable cities and more livable environments, is difficult, and trying to convince them to put money into public transport when it seems like it's a bottomless pit. So I think that's the second major consideration. And then I think the third thing is that often the work we do is in very constrained urban environments. You sometimes get asked to to come up with a solution, and you've got to look very carefully at you've only got so much road space. You've only got 20 or 30 or 40 meters to work within. You've got lots of underground services to take care of. You've got you would like to put in sidewalks as well as bicycle lanes and bus lanes, and still put in vehicle lanes. So it requires a lot of innovative thinking, and I think that is again a skill that you need to develop. So as a young engineer coming into public transport planning, I think again I would really encourage you to do courses in public transport planning, develop skills in public transport modeling, use public transport, get on a bus, get on a taxi, understand how these things operate, even consider postgraduate study, learn the skills that you need, like the conceptual design skills to come up with these innovative solutions. And one of the sort of most exciting things that I've done, and I think has helped me as a public transport planner, was to actually go overseas and look at international cities with great public transport systems, ride them, take photographs, speak to people who've developed them. And I think that way you can really get a sense of what public transport can be, and how to get there. So I would just challenge you all to become the next world expert on public transport.
Andre, I love that. Earlier in the sessions, we actually had a public transport planner said that if you're not passionate about it, you can't actually do it. So he was saying that in order for you to actually design public transport, you had to first be the passenger, and you echoed that exactly in what you just said. So I just wanted to ask, is there last things you feel that is important, or do you think you've pretty much summed it up?
I pretty much think I've summed it up. I might just leave you with a quote from Socrates. By far the greatest and most admirable form of wisdom is that needed to plan and beautify cities and human communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre, for your time. It's really been a pleasure. And any questions, I will just direct them to you.
Thank you very much.